Well, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Hope you can all hear me. If you can, maybe somebody can just type chat in the box so I know that I'm being heard out there. Welcome to the second part of our pre-workshop webinars. We're looking forward to seeing everybody out at the 4 East Bay Parks, John Muir and Eugene O'Neill National Historic Sites next week. And in preparation for that, we would like to present to you 2 more webinars. First up, we're going to talk about some of the Secretary Interior standards, and I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Julie McGilvery. Julie, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay. Yeah, if anyone can't hear me, let Keith know, and we can adjust. So I'm going to go ahead and get started because we have a full hour for you all. I'm Julie McGilvery. I'm the CLI coordinator in the Intermountain region of the Park Service, and I'm stationed in Santa Fe. And I'm going to talk today about the National Historic Preservation Act and the Secretary of the Interior standards for treatment. And Keith will be shifting slides for me, so you'll hear me asking him to do that throughout. And the thing to know is that my presentation is pretty heavy on policy. So there's going to be a lot of writing on the slides, and if you can't catch everything, let me know and I can pass this on to you and more information too. So, and also we're going to include the treatment standards and guidelines in the information you get next week. So Keith, if you want to go to the next slide, and we might have a little bit of a lag with the webinar. Okay, so we're going to start with the National Historic Preservation Act, and I'm going to generally talk about it, and then we're going to get into Section 110 and 106, and briefly how these relate to preservation horticulture. And then, of course, I'm going to touch on the Secretary of the Interior standards for treatment, give you a very broad overview of those, basically what they are. Next. Okay, so the National Historic Preservation Act is legislation intended to preserve historical and archaeological sites in the United States. And what's really important to know about the Act is that it really created our framework for historic preservation. So it gave us the National Register of Historic Places, the list of National Historic Landmarks. It gave us our state and tribal historic preservation programs, the Historic Preservation Fund, and the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, also known as the ACHP. And what's also interesting to understand about the NHPA and sort of the administering of it, so agencies fought long and hard to figure out which agency would be the one to really take on the responsibilities of historic preservation in this country, and that is the Park Service. So we're in a very honorable, awesome position to be able to do that. So you'll see throughout some references to the Park Service, and that's because we are the agency that takes the lead in preservation in this country. So one really important thing to know about the Act is that it created federal agency historic preservation responsibilities, and these are really Section 110 and 106. So let's take a closer look at what those mean. You may have heard them before. You might even be familiar with them. So next. And we'll talk about Section 110 first. So the main thing to know between the two is that Section 110 lays out our really responsibilities of how to take care of what we have. And Section 106 is a process when we have a project that we're doing. That's the most simplest terms to split the two of them. Next. So Section 110 of the National Historic Preservation Act sets out the broad historic preservation responsibilities of federal agencies and is intended to ensure that historic preservation is fully integrated into the ongoing programs of all federal agencies. And as you can see, the link to learn more about Section 110 is an nps.gov link. And again, that's part of our role as the lead federal agency in historic preservation. So next, let's take a closer look at what 110 means. So I like to think of the first 3 bullets as sort of laying out programmatic needs, documentation needs, and then the last 4 are about stewardship. So let's take a closer look at them. So first, the agency must establish a historic preservation program headed by a qualified historic preservation officer. So this is typically done at the WASO and regional levels. And as we know, we have cultural resources programs nestled into those regional offices and in WASO, and that is part of fulfilling this part of Section 110. Next, the agency provides for the timely identification and evaluation of historic properties under agency jurisdiction or control and or subject to effect by agency actions. So this is really telling an agency that it needs to know what it has and it needs to have evaluated it. So my program, the Cultural Landscapes Inventory, is fulfilling Section 110 for the Park Service. That is a 110 duty because we're identifying historic resources and we are evaluating them. Next, the agency nominates historic properties under the agency's jurisdiction or control to the National Register. And as we all know, the National Register is extremely important in historic preservation and its baseline documentation, and there is always a push to get DOEs done and get things nominated. And next, the 4 that are really about stewardship and dovetail with Section 106. An agency gives historic properties full consideration when planning or considering approval of any action that might affect such properties. An agency consults with knowledgeable and concerned parties outside the agency about its historic preservation-related activities. An agency manages and maintains historic properties under its jurisdiction or control in a matter that considers the preservation of their historic, architectural, archaeological, and cultural values. And an agency gives priority to the use of historic properties to carry out agency missions. So again, this is one part of the framework for historic preservation. It's asking agencies to have a historic preservation program, to know what they have, to have evaluated it, to put it on the National Register if needed, and then to take care of their properties. And we'll take a look now at Section 106. You can go to the next slide. And you can start to see how these things dovetail with each other. So Section 106 of the NHPA requires federal agencies to take into account the effects of their undertakings on historic properties. So again, Section 106 is a process, and it is there when you have an undertaking or a project. So let's say that you want to go out and remove some trees or plant new trees in an orchard. That is an undertaking. And how you define an undertaking is a project that involves federal land or federal money. So you need to consider its effect, and are you affecting a historic property when you do that? Next. So we're going to walk through the 106 process and just follow along as best you can. The main thing you need to know is the white heading. The very first thing you're going to do is initiate the Section 106 process itself. So the responsible federal agency first determines whether it has an undertaking that is a type of activity that could affect historic properties. Historic properties are properties that are included in the National Register and meet the criteria. So when we do a cultural landscapes inventory and we have a determination of eligibility out of that, that is meeting the criteria for the National Register. Also, if we have an idea that something might be of age, we think it might be significant, we need at this point to consider that if we think it might be affected. And I wanted to mention the age marker of 50 years. We typically stick closely to that, but that's not a hard and fast rule. That's a guide. So we need to really be looking before age 50 at our resources, especially when we know that we might be making changes and doing projects that might affect them. So if so, it must identify the appropriate state historic preservation officer, tribal historic preservation officer, also known as SHPOs and TIPOs, to consult with during the process, and there may be more than one, depending on what the project is and the size of it. The agency should also plan to involve the public and identify other potential consulting parties. So what is an other potential consulting party? Well, a good example of that is I work in the old Santa Fe Trail building in Santa Fe, and the building's a National Historic Landmark. And of course, when we do any work on it, which we have a big project coming up to re-roof it, to re-stucco it, we always consult the SHPO. But we also have lots of friends groups here in Santa Fe, and so we have a full list of people who may be interested in what's going on with this building, and we would consult with them to get their input. So if it's determined that there is no undertaking, or that the undertaking is a type of activity that has no potential to affect a historic property, then the agency is done with 106. So that's the very first thing that starts to happen during the 106 process. Next slide, please. So the next thing, if you think that you do have an undertaking, you need to move forward, you need to identify your historic properties. So if you've done your 110 and you know what you've got, it can make this portion of 106 much, much easier. And so that's why these things, again, this is building onto that framework of historic preservation, that it's important to kind of use them together because they do play off of each other. So if the agency's undertaking to affect historic properties, the agency determines the scope of appropriate identification efforts and then proceeds to identify historic properties in the area of potential effects. And often you get the area of potential effects through the consultation process with SHPOs and TIPOs and other involved parties. Next, the agency reviews background information, consults again with others, and seeks out information from knowledgeable parties and conducts additional studies if necessary. So the third bullet lists district sites, buildings, structures, and objects. That's sort of how you're going to go about looking at things for if something's eligible or listed on the National Register. Those are National Register property types and very much National Register language. Vegetation definitely falls within this. I know that we typically think of the National Register as being about buildings, but vegetation and design landscapes and all types of landscapes can fit into this. And typically we're looking at cultural landscapes as districts. A lot of vegetation can be a site if you have a big orchard, and also objects that could be individual heritage trees or things like that that you're trying to preserve. So vegetation absolutely fits into these property types very well, and cultural landscapes. Okay, bullet 4, if questions arise about the eligibility of a given property, the agency may seek a formal determination of eligibility from the National Park Service. And again, there's our role as a lead agency for preservation in the United States. If the agency finds that no historic properties are present or affected, it provides documentation to the SHPO or the TIPO, and barring any objection in 30 days, proceeds with its undertaking. And then finally, if the agency finds that historic properties are present, it proceeds to assess possible adverse effects. Next slide. So 3 is the assessment of adverse effects. Okay. So during this process, the agency is really in full consultation with affected parties, with the SHPO and the TIPO, and this is a discussion that occurs. And you may find that you may not think you have an adverse effect, but the SHPO might, or the TIPO might, or a group of people might that are interested in this project, a stakeholder of some kind. But if you agree that there's no adverse effect, then you can proceed with the undertaking and any agreed upon conditions. If they find that there's an adverse effect or the parties cannot agree, and the Advisory Council, again established under the National Historic Preservation Act, determines within 15 days that there is an adverse effect, the agency begins consultation to seek ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the adverse effects. Next. The next step is to resolve adverse effects. So basically, to resolve adverse effects, you often move back and forth with consultation. This is a give and take, and it can take some time. If you do have an adverse effect, then it usually results in a memorandum of agreement or an MOA, which outlines agreed upon measures that the agency can take to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the adverse effects. In some cases, the consulting parties may agree that no such measures are possible, but the adverse effects must be accepted in the public interest. Next. Implementation. So if you do have an MOA and it's executed, then the agency proceeds with its undertaking under the terms of the MOA. And usually these have a timeline to them. They have very specific things that must be followed. And it is kind of the instruction booklet then for the agency to follow to make sure that they're mitigating properly. Next. Okay, failure to resolve adverse effects. This is the last step. So hopefully you don't reach this point, but it's possible that you may reach this, and you can continue consultation with. Sorry, I have an announcement in my office.
In about 5 minutes, we're going to have a little memorial for Paul Javier and his plaque. Thank you, bye.
Sorry about that, you all. So if consultation proves unproductive, the agency or the SHPO or TIPO or the advisory council may terminate consultation. If a SHPO terminates consultation, the agency and the advisory council may conclude a memorandum of agreement without SHPO involvement. However, if a TIPO terminates consultation and the undertaking is on or affecting historic properties on tribal lands, the advisory council must provide its comments. And the agency must submit appropriate documentation to the advisory council and request advisory council written comments. And the agency head must take into account the advisory council's written comments on deciding how to proceed. Next. So in the end, when we are looking at Section 106 and Section 110, the main things, again, to remember are that 106 is the process that you follow when you have a project, which is an undertaking in 106 language that may affect historic properties. And work that you do on vegetation, pruning, planting, things like that, can definitely be undertakings, and 106 is often required. And it's hard to consider that for plants. Sometimes we don't think of those things as undertakings, but they are, and they should be reviewed. And then again, 110 is our sort of framework, that list of things that we need to be doing and we must do as a federal agency to make sure that we're taking care of our historic resources. So the next sort of piece of the overall framework for historic preservation then is the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Treatment. And there's standards for treatment, of course, for buildings, for cultural landscapes, for historic properties. So there's several guidance documents out there, and you'll see them sort of labeled for what they're for. We're going to include in your information and the jump drive that you'll get next week the treatment and guidelines for cultural landscapes. So you'll actually have that to look at. Next. Okay, so the standards are a series of concepts about maintaining, repairing, and replacing historic materials, as well as designing new additions or making alterations. So it's critical that we understand that they're concepts. They are neither technical nor are they prescriptive. So often you find people looking to the standards to give them design solutions and answers. That's your job as the professional, as the landscape architect, or as the horticulturalist to figure out how what you're planning to do actually meets the standards. So again, they're a concept. And then typically they're published with guidelines that offer general design and technical recommendations to assist in applying the standards to a specific property or property type. Together, they provide a framework for guidance for decision-making about work or changes to a historic property. And it's important to know that federal agencies use the standards and guidelines in carrying out their historic preservation responsibilities. State and local officials use them for reviewing both federal and non-federal rehabilitation proposals. historic district and planning commissions across the country use the standards and guidelines to guide their design review process. So when you have an undertaking under Section 106 and you're trying to figure out if you have an adverse effect or not, following the standards under preservation and possibly rehabilitation will really help guide that and can keep you from having an adverse effect. And of course, if you follow the standards and taking care of your buildings with routine maintenance and just sort of monitoring where things are with your historic properties, you're fulfilling Section 110 and your stewardship duties under 110. Next. So what is a treatment? We throw this word around a lot, and what we need to know about it is that it's a physical intervention carried out to achieve a historic preservation goal. Next. So there's several things that we want to consider when we're picking a treatment or picking a combination of treatments. Sometimes you have more than one. And so these are kind of critical things to keep in the back of your head. First is change in continuity. Very, very important. We know that change occurs, especially when we're dealing with vegetation. And so we know we have to allow for some change, but we need to make sure we have enough continuity there to still relay integrity and significance for a historic resource. Relative significance in history, this becomes very important in treatment decisions because we have some things that are extremely significant, such as a National Historic Landmark. It may have very high integrity, and we may need to choose only preservation as the only option for a property like that. Integrity and existing physical condition. This is really important. People often confuse integrity with condition, and they are not the same thing. So it's important to understand and evaluate the difference between these two things. Integrity is the authenticity of a cultural landscape's historic identity or a resource's historic identity. It's the physical evidence of its significance. Existing conditions can be defined as the current physical state of the landscape's form, order, features, and materials. For example, the integrity of an abandoned garden may be clear based on its extant form, features, and materials, but existing conditions may be poor due to neglect and deferred maintenance. Next is geographical context. This is the setting of the cultural landscape or the actual resource that you're dealing with. And when we are looking at a cultural landscape, it's what's outside of that boundary. And we want to make sure that we're choosing a treatment that's going to work with that. Use, historic, current, and proposed. So historic is past use, but current and proposed may change integrity if we're not careful. So we need to make sure that we're looking at that when we're choosing a proper treatment. Archaeological resources are critical. They're below ground often. They are definitely within cultural landscapes, and we need to make sure that we are aware of them and taking care of them and thinking about them when we choose treatment. Natural systems are the framework of many cultural landscapes, and vegetation often is straddling the line between cultural and natural resources. So when we pick a treatment for natural systems or vegetation that's within a natural system or something that could be considered both, we have to make sure that we're consulting properly with natural resource management so we don't give conflicting information through the treatment that we chose. Management and maintenance is very important. Management strategies are long-term and comprehensive. They can be one of the means for implementing a landscape preservation plan. Maintenance tasks can be day-to-day, seasonal, or cyclic, as determined by management strategies. Although routine horticultural activities such as mowing and weeding or general grounds maintenance such as reeling, pavement, or curbs may appear routine, such activities can cumulatively alter the character of the landscape. In contrast, well-conceived management and maintenance activities can sustain character and integrity over an extended period of time. Therefore, both the management and maintenance of cultural landscapes should be considered when selecting a treatment. And interpretation is something we need to consider because it can help people understand these landscapes better. And then accessibility, health and safety, environmental protection requirements, and energy usage are also very important things to consider. Next. So we have 4 treatment standards: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. In the Park Service, we typically only use preservation and rehabilitation. It's pretty rare for restoration and reconstruction to come up, even though it can. So let's take a closer look at what each one of them are. Next slide, please. Preservation is the act or process of applying measures necessary to sustain the existing form, integrity, and materials of a historic property. Next. So with vegetation, we want to identify, retain, and preserve historic features and materials under preservation. We want to stabilize and protect deteriorated historic features and materials as a preliminary measure. We want to maintain historic materials and features, and then limit replacement in kind of historic features. So preservation is really about keeping what we have and taking very good care of it. Next. Rehabilitation, I like to think of this as preservation that allows for some alterations and additions. So if you look at the standards and read them closely, it just builds on what preservation has. So don't think this means that we can do anything to a place or a resource. What it means is we're still functioning under preservation, but we're adding a little bit of flexibility for alterations and additions. Rehabilitation in historic preservation also means something different than how it's used in ecology, like grasslands restoration. So it's important to note that those 2 things are separate. And next week we can talk more about what those differences really are. So rehabilitation is the act or process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, and additions, while preserving those portions of features which convey its historical, cultural, or architectural values. Next. And this is what it looks like for vegetation. This is what we're shooting for with rehab. Identify, retain, and preserve historic features and materials. Protect and maintain those. Repair historic features and materials. Replace deteriorated historic materials and features. Design for the replacement of missing historic features, and alterations and additions as long as they're compatible for new use. Next. Restoration is the act or process of accurately depicting the forms, features, and character of a property as it has appeared at a particular period of time by means of the removal of features from other periods in its history and reconstruction of missing features from the restoration period. And again, we typically do not do this. We have to have very good records to know exactly what a certain period looked like, and we also have to have very good reason to strip away other layers of history. Next. With vegetation, you're going to identify, retain, and preserve historic features and materials from the restoration period. You're going to protect and maintain those features and materials from the restoration period. Repair features and materials from the restoration period, replace extensively deteriorated features from the restoration period, almost reconstruction-esque in some cases, remove existing features from other historic periods, and recreate missing features from the restoration period. Next. And last, reconstruction is the act or process of depicting by means of new construction the form, features, and detailing of a non-surviving site, landscape, building, structure, or object with the purpose of replicating its appearance at a specific period of time and in its historic location. Next. So this one's really simple. You simply reconstruct a non-surviving vegetation feature to depict the documented historic appearance. So if you had an alley historically in a landscape, if you want to put it back, that would be reconstruction. This one, again, just like with restoration, needs lots and lots of data on what you're actually trying to reconstruct. And if you don't have that data, then we would certainly not attempt to do that. And that is all I have on the standards and the NHPA today. The next slide is just a question slide, and we can wait to address questions early next week, or if you have a few at the end today, that's fine. Thank you very much.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Julie. If anybody has questions, there is a chat box on your dashboard for GoToWebinar, and you can type those in. I'll be monitoring that, but in the meantime, we're going to keep moving because I have another webinar for you. So bear with me while I switch over to the there we go. Okay, so that was a primer on the laws and legislation governing historic preservation and preservation maintenance, and my section was going to delve into a bit more of the nuts and bolts on the ground aspects of preservation maintenance. Now, of course, preservation maintenance entails the preservation of any resource, and our workshop is dealing primarily with horticultural resources. So with that in mind, first let's talk a little bit about what a cultural landscape is. And this should be a refresher for everybody who was on yesterday's webinar, because we talked about the fact that a cultural landscape is a geographic area including both cultural and natural resources. Natural resources and the wildlife and or domestic animals therein, associated with historic events, activities, or persons, or which exhibit other cultural or aesthetic values. Under that rubric, there are 4 identified landscape types that we study and maintain. They are historic designed landscapes, I don't know why it keeps doing that, I apologize. Historic designed landscapes, historic vernacular landscapes, historic sites, and ethnographic landscapes. A historic design landscape is a landscape that qualifies as a significant landscape from a design or artistic standpoint, or was consciously designed and laid out by a master gardener or a landscape architect or horticulturist to a specific design principle, or by an owner or other amateur according to a recognized style or tradition. My computer seems to want to advance ahead of me. A historic design landscape also has historical associations with significant persons, trends, or movements in the landscape gardening or architecture field, or a significant relationship to landscape theory or practice and landscape architecture. The next landscape type, historic vernacular landscapes, use construction or physical layouts that reflect endemic traditions, customs, beliefs, or values in which the expression of cultural values and social behavior and individual actions over time coalesce to form a unified landscape, but one that was not necessarily consciously designed according to any specific principles. With vernacular landscapes, we often think of, in the West, landscapes such as ranches and, there we go. In a vernacular landscape, the physical features and materials and their interrelationships, such as the patterns of spatial organization and land use, or circulation, or the gardens and vegetation around the landscape and within it, as well as the structures, all reflect the customs of everyday lives of ordinary people. A historic site is primarily significant for its association with a historic event, activity, or person, such as we'll see next week, John Muir. And the fourth category is an ethnographic landscape, which contains a variety of natural and cultural resources associated with people, or that associated people define collectively as a heritage resource. Included in this as well are plant communities, animals, subsistence grounds such as hunting grounds, and ceremonial grounds. So before undertaking any kind of preservation maintenance work in the landscape, it's important to document and research and plan for any kind of work, such as identifying a landscape's historic period of ownership and occupancy and development, or providing a foundation to make educated decisions for the treatment. Research and planning also guides the management long-term, as well as the maintenance and eventually the interpretation of that landscape. This is useful for compliance reviews, such as 106 and the National Historic Preservation Act. For preservation maintenance in the landscape, the primary document that we seek to refer to is the Cultural Landscape Report. If you aren't familiar with the Cultural Landscape Report yet, you will be soon, as we'll highlight the ones we have at John Muir and Eugene O'Neill National Historic Site. You'll often hear us refer to a CLR, and that it's just a shorthand term for Cultural Landscape Report. CLRs primarily they document cultural landscapes and the principal treatments therein, and are a primary tool for the long-term management of those landscapes. A traditional cultural landscape report is composed of 3 parts. Part 1 includes the history of the site, documenting the physical and prehistoric history of the site, as well as the existing conditions as they are at the time of research, and a thorough analysis and evaluation of all the elements within that landscape down to the individual plant level, as well as circulation and other small-scale features and all the elements that are composed within a historic landscape. Part 2 of a cultural landscape report entails the treatment of that landscape. So if you think of part 1 as really just gathering the facts, part 2 is the post-analysis treatment phase. Basically, what do we do? What shall we do? And what should we do with this landscape in order to treat it for historic posterity, as well as interpretation and all the other reasons that we want to restore it or treat it. And part 3 of the Cultural Landscape Report records that treatment and summarizes the treatment actions that have occurred at that site for posterity. So a Cultural Landscape Report documents the history, significance, and treatment of a cultural landscape, evaluating the history and integrity of the landscape, including any changes made to its features and material over time. CLRs provide managers and curators and others, such as the general public, with information needed to make effective management decisions. CLRs frequently uncover new information concerning that landscape's historic significance and integrity, and CLRs are prepared when a change to that landscape is proposed. And in these instances, CLRs can help protect the landscape's character-defining features from alteration or loss. And that is really the crux of why we want to analyze and study our historic landscapes, because we don't want to do any adverse impacts and remove historic features that may be important to that landscape's, the understanding of that landscape. So there are 13 different landscape characteristics that we tend to look at. They are natural systems and features, spatial organization, such as how was the landscape laid out by whoever laid it out or lived in it. It could be a design landscape or it could be a vernacular landscape, and they're all equally important to understanding how that landscape functions for the people who used it. The land use, of course, is the type of uses that occurred on that landscape. Was it a historic hunting ground or an ethnographic landscape? Was it an orchard or perhaps a ranch? The cultural traditions are a characteristic that we analyze because that's important to understanding the future treatment going forward and how we want to think about that landscape. Cluster arrangement is really just the arrangement of the elements within the landscape. Buildings, pathways, gardens, orchards, and such. Circulation, of course, is the network of pathways, roads, footpaths that allow people to navigate and get around the landscape. Topography is important because it often dictates the kinds of treatment, initial effects that went on in the landscape, how people shaped it. If it's a mountainous landscape, it may have terraces. If it's a flat landscape, it may have broad fields. So we want to understand how the topography informs how that landscape was formed by people. And vegetation, of course, is the types of plants contained within that landscape. We can often learn a lot about the values that the people who lived in that landscape held by the types of plants that we find in that landscape, whether they're food producing, perhaps treated for making textiles and such. Buildings and structures are pretty self-evident. We want to preserve those so we understand how people use the landscape to store items and live in the landscape as well. And views and vistas are also important, especially, say, for Civil War battlefields. Water features, not every landscape will have water features, but if they do contain those features, that's highly important, particularly out west where water is at such a premium and really dictates how landscapes are formed. Small-scale features could be windmills or wagons or maybe small barns or sheds. And of course, archaeological sites are highly important, and we always make sure that we are sensitive whenever we are treating a landscape or doing work in it, not to disturb or adversely impact an archaeological site. Landscapes, to be considered significant and character defining, must possess their historic integrity. The historic integrity is essentially the historic fabric that the landscape possessed or possesses, and those are composed of the elements of location and design, the setting, materials, workmanship, and also the feeling and association. When I think of feeling and association at our parks, and I'll point this out next week, one thing that John Muir National Historic Site used to have was a sense of rural quietude. But these days, it's been hemmed in by so many roadways that we've basically lost that sense, but not so much at Eugene O'Neill, which still retains that quality. Cultural Landscape Report, Part 2, the treatment phase. A treatment report basically summarizes the intentions behind the analysis and the recommendations made by the author on how to treat that landscape historically and appropriately, as well as the methods to use, time frames, cost, and implementation, which in the Park Service realm often includes Facility Management Software System, FMSS. Treatment Reports Part 2 will also contain copies of any available field reports, condition assessments, and contract summaries. At this time, I'd like to give everybody a brief quiz. I'm going to launch that now on your browser. I believe it's up. If you would take a moment, please, I'll wait for your answers. All right, that was quick. Looks like everybody got the right answers. Almost. Oh, it's changing. We had it. And we're just about back to perfect. The correct answers, of course, were the top three. We didn't get very tricky with that quiz. A cultural landscape report part 1 concludes a site history, existing conditions, and evaluation. Treatment would be part 2. So that's great. Thank you, everybody. So moving on to our next section, I want to talk a little bit about the on-the-ground maintenance of cultural landscapes and preservation maintenance. Now, I know most of us work in landscapes at parks, or at least are related to them somehow, whether we do or do not work physically with them. But it's important to mention that preservation maintenance differs from traditional maintenance in some significant ways. The goals of preservation maintenance, as we learned in yesterday's webinar, are to retain the historic character of that landscape and to retain the deteriorated features as well. And that runs contrary to what a traditional maintenance regime might entail. So if you have a tree or a shrub or annual plants that aren't doing so well, well, annuals I suppose are different, but any historic plant that goes back to the historic period of significance, we want to keep that regardless of whether its original function is completely 100%. In our case at John Muir, we have orchard trees that perhaps would have been replaced a long time ago, but because they were planted and go back to the John Muir era, we do everything we can to retain those trees, even in their aged states. We seek to replace missing features, such as missing gardens or other landscape features that might have been there, and we know from documentation from cultural landscape reports that did exist, but may not be there anymore. That would be a reconstruction. And we also seek to remove incompatible features. And I will discuss this next week as well. We have done some significant removals of incompatible trees at John Muir National Historic Site in an attempt, based on the treatment recommendations, to restore the landscape to a particular look at a particular time period. And in the spirit of rehabilitation, we also seek to make compatible alterations. So just because a plant is new to the landscape does not necessarily mean that it does not fit in that landscape. Often we seek to make compatible changes. Maybe a tree doesn't really grow that well in a certain location anymore, so we choose a tree that has a similar form, character, height, leaf shape, and so forth. And preservation maintenance does not decide the treatment, but it is important to consider before, during, and after the treatment and planning phases. Before planning and implementation, we seek to stabilize any deteriorated elements and prevent the loss of any resources, what we call arresting the rate of decay. During treatment is when we protect the extant features and repair other features and make them operable and interpretable again. And after treatment planning, we seek preservation maintenance seeks to perpetuate the treatment goals and preserve the historic character of that landscape per the recommendations. So we're going to breeze through some pictures of historic landscapes. This is Adams National Historical Park in Quincy, Massachusetts. Notice the boxwood hedges, the ivy, and the trees. Those are all as they appeared as much as possible back during the time period of John Quincy Adams. And that landscape is treated because we have the historical documents guiding that maintenance practice. Here we have a booklet excerpt showing the scale of the historic hedges, the heights, the preferred heights, and the tools to use those. This gentleman's using hand pruners, and that may have been a more historical practice than using, say, electrical hedgers. And that's a maintenance practice that managers may or may not want to implement. Preservation maintenance really seeks to mitigate adverse impacts from misinformed maintenance practices. On the left, we have an example of a peach tree that was girdled or nearly girdled by a weed whacker, and on the right, the effects of glyphosate or herbicide spraying on a headstone in a cemetery, of course. And for the sake of argument, some people may think that the clean headstone looks better, but from a historic preservation standpoint, we really want to retain that patina of age, especially on our built environment. There are 7 techniques that we employ for maintaining cultural landscapes. They are stabilizing, protecting, repairing, recurring maintenance, heroic efforts, and replacement in kind. Stabilization is the halting the deterioration of a feature to reestablish its stability. So sometimes that can mean literally stabilizing something, as in a tree prop. Sometimes that means horticultural stabilization, in the sense of arresting the rate of decay or the loss of a feature, such as this old apple tree that was planted about 1920 and as of recently had one small water sprout coming from the trunk, which was over the course of some years fallen back into a new tree and essentially a viable apple tree again. Protecting landscape resources. Different mechanisms can be employed to protect horticultural resources in the landscape, depending on the threats posed to those resources. In this example, we have a very sturdy caging system around an apple tree in the North Cascades National Park, where they have various large fauna such as elk and deer. Sometimes protection can mean protection from people as well. The Endicott pear is a nearly 400-year-old pear tree from Danvers, Massachusetts, planted by a pilgrim who emigrated in about 1630, or immigrated rather, and believe it or not, the Endicott pear is still alive. Suffered many indignities over the intervening centuries, but it's highly protected and for obvious reasons. Landscape repair. So typically we will talk about horticultural preservation maintenance, but preservation maintenance is not limited to just horticulture in the landscape. It can also be the preservation and repair of historic features such as seawalls at Golden Gate National Recreation Area. But it can also mean repairing horticultural features such as a girdled tree. This is an example of a bridge graft that seeks to bridge the lower cambium layer to the upper cambium layer in an effort to keep the plant alive and allow it some vascular circulation. Sometimes plants just get overgrown and we need to renew them. Renewal pruning is a form of repair that seeks to maintain the character of a landscape. And recurring maintenance is what we may most be familiar with, which is essentially hedging, mowing, weeding, watering. That kind of maintenance is very important because it keeps things alive and healthy. Occasionally, it's important and necessary to implement heroic efforts. Sometimes that can be propping a tree. As you can see, this tree from Kew Gardens has at least 4 different heavy-duty metal props under it, as well as what looks like a brick masonry structure at the trunk to support that. That would be an example of a heroic effort. But if a resource is that significant, sometimes it entails that level of effort. And finally, replacing in kind whenever possible. This is something we'll see next week at the John Muir grave site. This is an old pear orchard going back to about 1850. There used to be about 50 acres worth of pear trees, Bartlett's, but they're down now to about 7 or 8 trees extant of which we've been taking cuttings and propagating and replanting. So we'll have a discussion about replacing in kind next week. We have a few minutes, and I would like to send out one more quiz to everybody. You should be receiving it shortly. I'll give you a couple minutes to fill in the answers. Looks like just about everybody has voted. I apologize. Evidently, there's a way to share the results with the audience, but I'm not seeing that button right now, so I will just tell you what I'm seeing. The results are pretty good. Everybody got the two answers correct. There were two correct answers, which were retain historic character and make compatible alterations. The first answer was a bit of a trick question. It might seem like you want to replace deteriorated features, but in a historic landscape, we actually seek to retain deteriorated features as long as possible, either through stabilization, propagation, or good horticultural practices. Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for doing that. And I wanted to share a few of the references that were included in this presentation. A Cultural Landscape Inventory Professional Procedure Guide, the National Register Bulletin 15 on evaluating integrity, as well as Preservation Brief 36, which is a good primer on cultural landscapes. So I would encourage everybody to at least check those out. Google them if you can. I know those links are long, but this webinar will be recorded if you want to come back and check it out and get those links yourself. And with that, I would like to open up the floor to any questions if you have them. I am going to attempt to unmute everybody. Bear with me one second. I'm not sure if that worked. Can anybody tell me if they can talk on the phone? Let's see. I'll do this manually. There we go. And I know yesterday we had a bit of an echo chamber issue, so it sounds like now. I believe everybody's unmuted. Are there any questions? There are just a few people who I cannot unmute here from the webinar dashboard, but it sounds as though we don't have any questions. Well, that concludes our Part 2 webinar, and I want to say that we're really looking forward to seeing everybody out here at the for East Bay Parks will be John Muir National Historic Site and Eugene O'Neill National Historic Site on Tuesday morning. We'll see you in the parking lot, and then we'll shuttle up to Eugene O'Neill. Refer to your logistic packet that Miranda Welsenbach has sent out. So if there aren't any questions, and I'm seeing none, I think we will sign off, and I want to thank everybody for another webinar. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.